everybody. This is going to be one of my first official YouTube videos. And why, you ask? Because TikTok does not have a long enough time limit for me to talk about all the terrible things wrong with this book. I need a platform that will give me the time to fully express how much hatred I have for this piece of garbage. I grew up in an IFB home, Independent Fundamental Baptist, and as I was growing up, we read and heard about a lot of books on how to be a good housewife, one of which was the infamous Created to Be His Helpmeet. While I had not read it, it was something that I heard people talking about as I was growing up, and my mother said that her parents had it growing up and it was sold in the college she attended. Recently, one of my viewers suggested that I read Created to Be His Helpmeet by Debi Pearl, and I just want to let you know, whichever one of you out there did that, the amount of suffering I have been through and the amount of therapy I'm going to need to get over it is now partially your responsibility. I feel like before I start, I should explain just who Debi Pearl is. Debi Pearl is the wife of Michael Pearl. Michael Pearl and his wife run No Greater Joy Ministries, which is a ministry that focuses on family life. They are prolific authors of several books on dating, marriage, and child rearing. They also sell videos, run a blog, and run a magazine. They are famous for the horror book that is known as To Train Up a Child, which I have not read, and honestly, I don't know if I can put myself through that knowing some of the stuff I've heard people say is in there. All that to say, let's start dissecting the worst marriage book I've ever read, Created to Be His Helpmeet. Let's start at the beginning of the book. In the first chapter, it says, "This is how God created you and your purpose for existing," in reference to being a helpmeet. She distinctly says that as a woman, you exist to serve a man and not to fulfill your own desires, as that is masculine. This is also reiterated in one of the last chapters of the book, where it says that women who are not submissive enough will die unloved, uncherished, and not in God's Hall of Fame. She says they will be a total failure. Those are her exact words. While Eve was made for Adam in the beginning, this is a gross oversimplification of the reason women exist. God even says in the Bible that women exist to serve God, and only after a man and woman marry do both parties have a duty to spend time thinking about their spouse and family. 1 Corinthians 7:24 says, "There's difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman care for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married care for the things of the world, how she may please her husband." The same is said in the verse before it about men. Women are not simply creatures that exist to serve a man. We exist to serve God first. She puts this near worship of the husband above everything. She tells women that they are to default to their husband's beliefs and views, and that we are not supposed to ask what is right, but who has authority. This is an extremely unbiblical view that you do not see in the Bible at all. Authority is important, but that is because it is righteous to obey authority. It keeps order in society and helps enforce righteousness. It is not that authority itself is what creates righteousness. The view that is being portrayed here is backwards. Numerous times throughout the book, Debi insists that women have complete submission or else their husbands will leave them. She says if you end up divorced, either by your choices or his choices, which she will imply that you have provoked, God will not be there for you and you will be alone and in poverty. She even has an example of a woman who had 7 children, despite her husband wanting to not have a lot of kids, and saying that because this woman was rebellious, her husband abandoned her and God would not help her. Even though she had written Debi asking for help, Debi said that because God would not help this woman, and Debi wasn't going to help her either. I can think of few things more judgmental and cruel. Also, while I don't necessarily condone divorce, she claims that being alone and unloved is much worse than being with a husband who isn't very kind. And I think we all need to remember the verse in Proverbs 15:17 where it says, "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." We're just going to skip right over the good, which is pretty much non-existent and is made at best, and go straight into the bad that's in this book. This starts out with Pearl's overall attitude about women. I personally feel like Pearl has little to zero respect for most women. At least the way she expresses her views of them comes across that way. Throughout this book, she calls women at various times demeaning things. She calls a woman a cranky, demanding leech for wanting her husband to help her out around the house. She calls women an office wench. She says some women are crazy, bitter old women. She calls women who don't look into vaccines and what there's really in them dumb clucks. She calls women ball and chain wives for having babysitters. And of course, my favorite, she calls women Jezebels. There are times when in stories she has her imaginary characters call immodest women cows, pigs, and diseased animals. She says that if you have daycare or babysitters, you also should not consider yourself a real mom. This lack of respect for women can be contrasted to the amount of reverence she believes women should treat men with. She believes that women should form their hobbies, friendships, schedules all around their husbands. She says that women who have their own lives and goals will eventually probably get cheated on by their husbands, who want a real soulmate who's completely invested in him. She says a wife should take off her husband's shoes, spend at least 15 minutes every single day satisfying him, and that she should never complain. She says that you should not spend time talking to family and friends on the phone. Even if you're a stay-at-home mom with no children and you're bored, you should be looking only to your husband for companionship. She has a little statement about women who have close female friends. She's not even talking about lesbianism, just women who are close friends of women, and this is her word for word saying about it. Women bonding with other women. Instead of the perfect picture of Christ in the church, today we have perverted expressions of women satisfying women. What a disgusting mess. No, again, this isn't even talking about lesbianism. She's just talking about having close female friends. Debbie, you can be honest. You can just say you don't have any friends. Anyway, throughout the book, over and over and over, Debbie insists that you can change your husband if you are a good wife. If your husband mistreats you, just be better and he'll change. She says, though, that God only promises wives this. Though, if I remember correctly, there is no such promise in the Bible. God does say that we should stay married to our non-Christian spouses as we can be a good influence on them and they can become Christians, but this is not a guarantee. She also says that women can do this much more often than men, even though both men and women are mentioned in the original passage. If you thought all this was bad, remember, we haven't even gotten to the ugly yet. I just want to put a warning. This part of the video is going to contain sensitive content, which I shall list on the screen. If you do not feel comfortable watching this part of the video, please skip to the timestamp that is listed. Debi Pearl is not content to simply blame women for the shortcomings of their husbands in pretty much every area. She goes so far as to say that women who are being abused could change their husbands and stop them from being abusive if they were just better women. She gives the example of a woman called Sunny. Sunny is a real woman, though the name is fake, whose husband beat, humiliated, and even tried to murder her. Debbie claims that Sunny was so distraught, she herself was willing to kill her husband to end her torment. Debbie's advice to Sunny was either to leave him or to quietly endure it and just pray that God works a miracle and changes his heart. She tells Sunny, though, that if she stays, she must stop all complaining. She is not to tell her friends, family, or church members about any of the abuse she's going through, but only say good things about her husband to him and others. Debbie claims that Sunny followed her instructions and that now her husband is a Christian and treats her wonderfully and their marriage is wonderful. First of all, okay, now that story is out there, I think we need to take a time out. First of all, Debbie told her to stop talking about the abuse. So, he could still be abusing her. She's just not talking about it. Secondly, even if the husband did change, Debbie had no right to give Sunny advice like that. Sunny and her 3 children, yeah, it was listed in the book that she had children, easily could have been murdered by her abusive husband. Debbie also says that the reason the husband changed was because he became what his wife said he was. So when she spoke negatively, he was going to act that way and vice versa. So Debbie, not only are we telling a wife to stay with a beating, murderous husband, we are also telling them that the reason he treated her or did not treat her a certain way was at least partially her fault. Let me just say of all the things in this book, this one was the only one that's actually not true. Let me just say that as I was reading this book, there were lots of things that made me angry or like disgusted me. This though was probably the one thing that actually physically disgusted me and angered me the most. When I first read it, I was filled with so much rage. I felt like I physically could not contain it. Debbie is a Christian sister, and I try to assume that you, if you're watching this, wrote this with good intentions, but that does not change how I feel about the content of what you wrote. It literally, physically disgusts me. You could have literally had the blood of a woman and her children on your hands, and then claimed it was in the name of God, no less. The Bible is against divorce as much as possible, yet it also says that people will get divorced, and shows instructions on how to live after you're divorced. The Bible also shows that apostles and disciples exercise their rights within Roman law. Paul does this numerous times when people try to put him to death. He didn't just say, oh, well, Christ said to turn the other cheek, so I'm just going to get murdered. No, he used the law to its full capacity to protect himself. And Christian women in modern American society should use that right as well. And they have a duty to protect themselves and their children, especially their children. There are several times in the Bible, such as in Egypt when Pharaoh wanted to practice infanticide, that people lied to protect others. Is lying a sin? Yes. But it's a much greater sin for people to be killed. Is divorce a sin? Yes, but it's much greater sin for a woman and her children to be abused. This section isn't even close to being done. Now that I ripped the Band-Aid off and showed off the worst of the worst, I just want to highlight a few other things in this book that I felt like deserve special attention. Debi says you need to put up with painful and uncomfortable intimate activities. I'm just going to read off a paragraph, what it says word for word, and you can just take her words and make your own conclusions. She writes, "Don't talk to me about menopause. I know all about menopause, and it is a lame excuse. Don't talk to me about how uncomfortable or painful it is for you. Do you think your body is special and has special needs? Do you know who created you? And do you know he's the same God who expects you to freely give sex to your husband? Stop the excuses. If your heart is right with God, you will focus on his needs and lay aside your own selfish, prudish attitude." Her justification for this is that the Bible says that you are not to defraud your spouse and that your body's no longer your own, which it does say that. You're right, Debi. Except the verse does not stop there. It also says that the husband's body is not his own. So a wife's pleasure should be just as much a priority as his. And besides this, elsewhere in the Bible commands a husband to treat his wife's body as his own. So if a man does not want to be pressured into painful, humiliating, intimate activities, especially when that is the last thing he wants to do, I'm pretty sure he should not be doing that to her. These verses are supposed to be about mutual respect, working together. They are not meant to be taken in a vacuum and simply used to clobber the other person into submission. Finally, I know I said what I talked about earlier made me the most angry in this book, but that's a lie. This also really, really, really upset me. Debi Pearl talks about why women are supposed to be stay-at-home moms and not work outside the home. And she gives a story talking about a missionary couple. And the missionary couple had a little girl. And the little girl was abused. The girl was abused while the mother was in another room doing missionary work. She had left the little girl alone for 10 minutes tops. And Debi heavily implies that this is the mother's fault to some extent because she was doing ministry work. How dare you? We have a mother here who loves God, her child, who has devoted her life to serving God and the church with her husband, and you dare to judge her and say that her child was abused because she was helping out with the ministry, that she was doing things for the church more than you think she should have been. This is beyond cruel and the most despicable thing in this book. And I feel like there's a lot of things in this book that are bad that I haven't even mentioned, and I'm not going to mention in this video, but I feel like it was important for this to be concluded because it shows just how radical the Pearl's beliefs are about how they'll blame women for everything that goes wrong. You know, another man abuses your child, you were out of the room for literally a couple minutes, your fault. Your husband beats you and tries to murder you, you could prevent that if you were just a better wife. Everything, almost everything, is made to be the woman's fault one way or another. These teachings are just so opposite of everything about the compassion and love of Christ that he talks about. And the fact that Debi goes around parading this as being the only way, as being God's way, just, it's borderline blasphemy. Now, some of you out there are going to try to justify the stuff that she's written by saying that, you know, well, Debi and her husband say that women shouldn't put up with abuse because, you know, near the end of the book, she talks about what to do in extreme cases. You know, she does say at one point that if your husband is the children, that you are to immediately report it to the authorities. Okay, good. Bar's literally in hell, so glad we can agree on something, Debi. Oh, wait, that's right. In another chapter, you also said that after you send your husband to prison for abusing the children, that you should make sure the children visit him at least a few times a year, that you need to encourage him and be there for him, and that you should hope that he gets out of prison when the children are grown, you know, so that they don't have to live with him anymore. Divorce and permanent separation are never even mentioned as valid options. Okay, never mind, Debi. We can't even come to an agreement on that, apparently. All this to say, the Pearls are double-tongued. They say they're against women staying with men who beat them, but then you also see the earlier story we mentioned. The Pearls justify some of this, saying that, well, women who are abused are just going to stay with their husbands anyway, so we should treat them how to get along with their husbands so they can be safe. Again, literal victim blaming. Michael Pearl even says God wants us to suffer abuse because it glorifies him. Michael Pearl literally says word for word that we need to suffer abuse in silence for the glory of God. He also says never to express feeling miserable about the abuse, as that is not honoring God, and it will cause your husband to not repent. He even says no wonder about him not repenting, implying that the husband did not repent simply because you were feeling unhappy for being abused. Michael, could you just do us a favor and never talk about anything in the Bible ever? I think we'd all be a lot happier if you could do that. I personally believe that the Bible does talk about how we can tolerate bad situations. We have to remember this was written during the Roman Empire where people were slaves. There were people with pretty much no rights. And in these situations, God wrote instructions on how to endure this suffering and have patience. But again, as I mentioned earlier, people who did have legal rights exercise them. And I have a hard time believing God would want us to put up with this abuse when there are legal ways to escape it in our country. We also have to remember Christians are the ones who put a lot of these laws into place to begin with because it is an injustice. God put authority in the government to protect people. I feel like it is the definition of being double-tongued. And I just feel like, in my personal opinion, that they're trying to cover their own butts. So that way when abuse does happen, they can be like, well, we said, we don't approve of abuse. And that if your children are being abused, you can leave. But I mean, he also said that God promises that if you obey God and are always submissive to your husband, no matter what, and no matter how abusive your husband is, God will make sure you're never harmed, which is a pile of malarkey. The reason I'm talking about these things, people are going to be like, why are you even bringing this up? We already have so much negativity in the world. Why do you have to talk about this gosh awful marriage book? That's an abomination. And the reason I am talking about this and other crazy books, if you've checked out my TikTok, is because I personally believe that these kinds of writing has consequences. An entire generation of men and women were reading these kinds of books at Bible colleges, at churches. This book was very well known in the IFB community. Even outside of the IFB, think of literally the thousands of men and women who have read this book and applied its principles thinking that this is God's will. Debi herself mentions in the book that thousands of women write to her and her husband all the time asking for personal advice. She's the one who says this, that they're very popular. She's the one who says that she and her husband, get a lot of letters asking what they should do. If you think these books have no consequences, I want to read you a letter. Now, before I get sued, I want to clarify I'm not an expert on domestic violence or abuse. I'm not qualified to make any assumptions, and I am not claiming that the Pearls are directly or even indirectly responsible for any abuse that has happened. I do want to read an interesting article, though, from the Pearls magazine. And no, I did not pay for this magazine. It's a free magazine that a friend of mine gets, and then she gives it to me. This book was originally written in 2004. I have the updated version, 10th anniversary, so 2014. But, same book, just extra stuff. So, 2024, the Pearls released a magazine article, and I wanted to tell you what it said. In it, Pearl says that she noticed that for some strange reason, men have become increasingly abusive to women in the church. She claims that her husband and her have been getting numerous letters with graphic abuse being depicted, so graphic that it literally leaves her shocked. She talks about an Amish man who beats his wife, and the wife asking Debi how she can submit more to make it stop. She says in amazement, word for word, this is now a thing, and then goes on to blame the issue on adult entertainment. Again, I'm not going to directly blame the Pearls for anything. As I mentioned in this video, people are responsible for their own actions, and one of my biggest issues with the Pearls is that they blame women for everything the husband does. So people make their own choices to treat people how they want. I'm not going to say they caused it. But we do have to consider the position the Pearls have, and that they give themselves. They speak in churches, they write books, they share videos, they blog, they have a magazine. They even claim at certain times in Creativity's Help Me that if you don't agree with their views, such as on dress standards, you're probably not even a real Christian, you're going to go to hell. There's a harsh level of condemnation towards those who disagree, as can be seen earlier in this video. When someone puts themselves in that level of authority and then makes the kinds of claims that can be found in this book, is there any wonder that people are going to take them at face value? You saw earlier, Michael Pearl says God promises as long as you're submissive and respectful, God will make sure no harm comes to you. She says that you should not defend your children from your husband's discipline if you think it's too harsh. She says to get over yourself and endure painful, uncomfortable, and exotic sex. She says that you solely exist to please and serve your husband. She literally tells a woman whose husband tried to kill her that not only should staying be considered an option, but if she does, she should not complain about it. And yet she blames inappropriate adult entertainment as the sole problem, something Christian men aren't even supposed to look at in the first place, and I'm pretty sure Amish men do not have access to. That's what's responsible, not the bad teachings that can be found in this and several other books. Again, I clarify, these men are solely responsible to God for what they have done. All I am saying is that I believe, personally, that these teachings, the teachings that these people are claiming in the name of God, are part of the problem. I would even dare to say they're a major problem in conservative churches as to why men treat their wives the way they do. Throughout the book, Debi talks about the verse that says, you reap what you sow. And Debi, I have to agree with you completely. You sow women being responsible for all of men's actions, even when they're being abused. You sow women submitting to nearly any degrading act. You sow women not having their own moral guide or convictions at all, just completely relying on their husband. You sow women not having lives of their own, simply existing to serve men. And I believe this is what you reap. You reap men who abuse and blame their wives for everything, and women who live in fear and pain. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate you all. If you wish to watch more videos, please like and subscribe. If there are any books you want me to read, please recommend them below. There are several that I own and plan to go through. Check out my other videos here and on TikTok to hear about other bad marriage books and bad theology. May God bless you and keep you in peace.